I want to take a look at some of the debugging tools that are available to us in VS Code. Now, I'll be using VS Code for this video, obviously, but really any modern fully featured IDE probably has debugging tools. And in fact, they're probably very, very similar to what I'm going to demonstrate in this video, maybe close enough that you could even figure those out based on what I demonstrate here. If not, you have a couple choices. There are undoubtedly good resources out there for whatever IDE you are using, and you can go take a look at those. This also might be a good chance to try out Visual Studio Code if you haven't done so before. Um, I don't really believe that any one IDE is better than another. VS Code is what I happen to like right now, but I've used several others over the years. I kind of switch back and forth. So there's nothing special or magic about VS Code here. I just think it's what I'm comfortable with at the moment. Now, just to be clear, none of these tools are required in order to debug your code. You can do a lot of debugging just with some of the things that I mentioned in my general debugging video, especially just adding output statements everywhere to see what's going on. And that's how I do most of my debugging, to be honest. But sometimes you just run into a really stubborn bug, or you're dealing with code that is just really confusing to you, especially if somebody else wrote the code and you don't quite follow what they're doing. These kinds of debugging features can give you a great way to get insight into your code and to kind of step through it as it is running. You may have the thought when you start looking at this, well, geez, this is really useful. I wish you would have shown me this before. I could have been using this all this time. What's up with that? I don't like to show debugging tools too early to students when they're first learning how to write code because I don't want the IDE to be a thing that you have to learn. I don't want you to have to worry about learning how the tool works. I want you just to be focusing on how to write the basic code. And the truth is, in the first few concepts that you learn in programming, your bugs really shouldn't be that complicated, right? It's usually just dumb mistakes because you don't understand how things work yet. Once you start getting to branching with if statements and things like that, and you start getting into loops, now our code starts to become a little more complex, and the execution is maybe a little harder to follow in your head. So it's a good time to begin using the debugging tools you have at your disposal. So let's switch over to VS Code and take a look. This is just a really simple little program that we're going to use to try out some of these debugging techniques and some of the tools that we have available to us. And it's really straightforward. It's got a few different functions here. Some of them have arguments, a couple of them return values so that we're passing data back and forth. A couple of them have loops. And it's really just meant to be sort of a variety of the kinds of things you might run into when you are debugging code of your own. And the first thing we're going to do is just run this and see what's going on. So it executes. This is a runtime error, not a compiler error, but it just seems to get kind of hung up there. It's just kind of frozen. So I don't know what's causing that. We'll have to kind of dig into this and take a look. The first thing we want to take a look at with a debugger is the idea of breakpoints. And so a breakpoint lets us pick a spot in our source code that where the program will execute until it hits that breakpoint, and then it will kind of pause and stop execution in a way that lets us kind of examine what's going on with the program up until that point. All right. And so we can set breakpoints in VS Code. If I just move my mouse over here to where all the line numbers are, it might be hard to see in the video, but there's kind of a light red dot or a dim red dot that kind of follows to whichever line number I have selected here. And if I pick a line, I'm going to pick the very first line of my main method, and I'm going to click that red dot. It makes it a little bit brighter, and it has now added a breakpoint. And I can add as many breakpoints as I want. I can just click them on and off. And as we kind of see how breakpoints work, you can decide if you want more than one or not. And what I've set up here, what I've tried to set up here, is that when my program runs, it's going to start executing the main method here, and it's going to immediately stop at this breakpoint and let me take a look at what has happened to that point. So theoretically now I would just hit run, and this would work. except it doesn't. We seem to get the same results as we had before. So in VS Code, in order to make sure that I am recognizing breakpoints and I'm able to go into that kind of suspended animation mode, I have to run my program in a special way. I have to the term that they use is I have to attach a debugger to when I execute it. You can also just think of it as kind of debugging mode. And to get there, there's a button over here in our left-hand toolbar called Run and Debug. If I expand that, I have a couple links that are about configurations because there's all kinds of setup you can do to have special, to have a lot of control over the way your debugging session works. We don't care about that. We're just trying to learn the basics. So I'm going to use this giant button that says Run and Debug. Okay, so this looks a little bit different. Let's take a look at what we got. In our editor, I can see that line 6, where I had my breakpoint, it's now got a yellow pointer and that line is highlighted. That's representing where program execution is at this point. And just to be clear, program execution is at the beginning of this line. It hasn't executed this line of code yet. There's a bunch of other user interface stuff going on here for us. So up at the top, we have a toolbar, and the buttons here are continue, step over, step into, step out, restart, stop, and then you may or may not have this one that's kind of hot code replace or hot code reload. That one we're not really going to talk about because that's a little bit complicated and it depends a lot on what kind of code you're debugging here. But the rest of this video, we are going to take a look at what all of these do. We also have, over on the left, we have a panel with a couple different little areas here. The main one is variables. And so I can see all of my local variables. In other words, all the variables that are within scope at this point. And I only have one. You might not even really understand it very much, depending on how far you are with your coding understanding. But this goes back to this first main method, this first line of code that you learned the day you did Hello World, and you maybe still don't understand completely. The main method has an argument called args. It's an array of strings, and we're not using that. It has to do with command line arguments when you run this from a command line. So it's kind of empty, but that is shown there because that is a variable that exists at this point in the program. The next panel down has a place where we can set up watches if there's certain things we want to kind of watch for or keep an eye out for. The call stack has to do with the way that everything has been being sent through memory. And we have some breakpoint information down here at the bottom. We won't get into those windows very much. But let's head back over here and look at this toolbar. The most obvious one is the stop button, right? If I hit the stop button, it ends program execution and we go back to just the regular editor. I can now, turn on or off my breakpoint and pick different breakpoints or do whatever. The other thing, now that I've run it at least once in debug mode or with the debugger attached, I can come up here to my run button. And if I click that open, kind of hard to see there in the video maybe, but I have two choices. I can run Java or I can debug Java. And so I'm just going to hit debug. And you notice it's got that little debug icon going on there. And I'm right back where I was, right? I've hit that breakpoint again and stopped. So a couple other obvious buttons here. We've got restart, which I can just run it again. That's not useful to us for now, but as we start stepping through code, you may go, okay, let's start it over and see what's happening now that I know what to watch for or something like that. And then the very first button over here is continue. And continue is just what it sounds like. We've hit a breakpoint and we've kind of like paused. And so continue is going to go ahead and resume execution from that point forward. And I'm going to get right back to that sort of frozen state that I was in, right? So let's go ahead and stop that. The usefulness of setting a breakpoint is going to come from those other buttons on the toolbar. So again, you notice that now the last time I ran it in debugging mode. So that becomes kind of my default. So I can just run that again. Here I am at my breakpoint, and we have all of these buttons up here that are about stepping through our code. And so step over is the one you're going to use most often. And step over means just run this next line of code. And if it is sending us into another method, it's going to go run that method instantly and then come back. It's going to keep executing just like normal. So if I hit step over this first line of code, I can see now this line of code declared a couple of variables and assigned values to them. So those now show up over here in my local variables panel. You can also see that it's, for the sake of convenience, it's also kind of displaying those values over here. So this is already starting to look a little bit promising. I can kind of keep an eye on those variables and just see what's going on with those values and see how they're changing. Um, the pointer is on the next line of code now because I have just taken one step. I didn't hit continue. We've gone one step. Let's go ahead and step over this next line. It's another declaration, and it's created now a string called EMCC. And what you notice is that this one is a little bit different. I've got a little arrow here I can expand, and that's because a string is an object. And so I can, with an object, as opposed to these primitive variables, those are called primitives, an object has a bunch of other information that's part of it, and so I can expand that and take a look through it. Now, what you see there may or may not be particularly interesting to you or understandable to you, but it might be. And incidentally, just in case you're wondering, it says the value equals this little array because a string is ultimately basically an array of characters. And so 69, 77, 67, 67, those are the ASCII values for capital EMCC. So this is just showing how this data is being represented within our my school string. So far, so good. Now I'm going to hit step over one more time. And oops, I'm now on, this is the, I've now stepped over the say hello method, and the say hello method has output some data. And I've now gotten to this next line of code. And I think this is a good place to kind of restart and take a look at that say hello, because maybe we want to dig into that method a little bit. So I'm going to restart this and go back to that first breakpoint. And here I am. I'm going to step over, and now at this say hello, instead of saying step over, I'm going to say step into. And what that means is I want to step onto this line of code, but if it sends me somewhere else, I want to go there and actually keep stepping through that method. So I'm going to hit step into, and it has now jumped into my say hello code. A handful of things have changed here. First of all, I can see that I have a new local variable called school. This is the parameter that we passed in here. It's EMCC, but what you notice is that it doesn't have the local variables we were looking at before, because those are scoped to the main method. They're not accessible within say hello. So this locals panel here only shows you what is accessible at this point in program execution. Now it turns out it's a string again that holds the same data, but in this case it's not the same variable, right? Because this one is from the argument, right? I'm now at the first line of code within say hello, and I'm going to, well, let's try stepping into this system out println statement and see what happens if we step into, because println is a method call, right? It's not a method that we created, but it's a method that that is part of this this kind of system package, right? So let's go ahead and step into that. And now we're getting deep into Java. You can see that it's opened a new window here, and I am in something called the print stream class. And here is the println method. This is possibly interesting to you it might not be very useful to us because I have to assume that the print line method is not the cause of my problem yet. But if I want, I can kind of keep stepping through here. I can keep stepping in and get deeper and deeper. But I can also step out. And what step out means is execute now through the rest of this kind of code block and then go back to wherever we came from. So like if I don't want to kind of individually step through each line, I've seen what I want to see in this method. I know it's okay, so I'm just going to step out. And it's going to jump right back to where we left off. And so down here in my terminal, by the way, it has output hello. And I don't really need to see the details of a print statement again. So I'm just going to, well, in fact, let's try the step out method. The rest of this looks pretty good, right? It's just output. So I probably don't need to really step through those. So if I say step out, it's going to run the rest of this code until we're out of this method, and then it's going to stop again. All right, so we're back here in our main method. We've executed the rest of that say hello method. We can see that output down below. I can also see that my locals window over here has updated again, and I'm back in the main method, so I'm only seeing data that is local to main. Whatever data incidentally was in the say hello method is now gone. The way Java, the Java runtime environment is going to manage all that memory, but it's actually that variable, that data has been marked for data collection, garbage collection, excuse me, and that's literally what it's called. It gets marked for garbage collection because it's not used anymore. And periodically, while your program's running, there's a process that goes through and looks at all the things that have been marked for garbage collection and sort of frees up that memory so that other data can go there. So my next method is rand sum equals sum of randoms 5. And so this is another method call. Let's go ahead and step into this one. All right, so I step into this one, and this is going to create a random number, okay? A random number, RNG, random number generator. It's going to create a random object. Let's keep stepping here. I'm going to step over that. I don't need to kind of go through the constructor call for random. You can see here's that object over here, right? It's got the stuff that has been, this is a class that comes with Java, so I didn't create that. Next line of code is going to declare something called sum, and set that to 0. And now we're entering a loop. And so this is one of the things that is really one of the situations where a debugger is really handy because loops can be really tricky to debug. So I'm going to now start stepping through this code. So I is my counter. It's been set to 0. Quantity is equal to 5. Quantity is that this parametric data that was passed in here. Now we have created, I don't have a lot of space here because I'm all zoomed in for the sake of the video, but random number is equal to 1. This line of code is just asking for a random number between 0 and 9 inclusive. So it's generated 1. That's just coincidence. It could have been anything. And now I'm going to step through this. That's supposed to add that 1 onto sum. And I can see that that's what it did. Now that's the end of the iteration, so we're back up at the for statement here. So I'm going to step again. I has gone from 0 to 1, excuse me. We're going to generate a random number. That random number now is 2. That is just coincidence. It doesn't seem like it. Like we got 1 and then 2. That seems kind of weird, right? But it's just coincidence. We're gonna, well, I should say, we assume it's coincidence. That maybe one of the things we find out when we're debugging is that we've got some problem with our random numbers. In this case, I'm not worried about that being the problem. Let's step over it again. Okay, the sum is now 3 because it added that 2 onto it. Now the I is going to be 2. We're going to generate a new random number, 6. So just in case you were worried that we were going to get 3, we've gotten 6 now. And it's pretty clear that this loop seems to be just fine. And so at this point, I think I'm just going to step out of it because the loop doesn't seem to be the problem. So it has executed and we have jumped back now to this to where we started. Okay. And our rand sum was the name of that variable, is equal to 22. So that was the result of all the addition of those random numbers. I have no idea what the use of that method would be. I just needed a method with a loop in it to be able to show that. So if you ever wanted a method that generates a bunch of random numbers and adds them together, there you go. You are welcome to steal mine. And now the next line of code is going to call a new function, a new method, excuse me, called sum between, and I've passed in kind of two numbers to that. And it's going to take the result of that and assign it to a variable that I've called between sum. So once again, let's step into that. All right, here we go. And we're going to create a variable called sum. We're going to create a variable called counter, and it turns out those two numbers I gave it are low and high because we're going to do a range. And so we're going to set the counter to start at low. And now we're going to jump into a do while loop. And the loop looks good at first glance, right? Do this code as long as the counter is less than or equal to high, which is that upper limit. So the idea of this method, it looks like, is going to be to add up all the numbers between low and high, including those two. So sort of an inclusive sum. All right, so sum is 0. Counter is 2 at this point. So now sum should be 2 because we've added it on. It's going to check that. It's going to see is the counter, which is 2, less than high, which is 4. And that is, so it's going to iterate again. And now the sum is 2, the counter is 2. It's going to add that counter onto the sum, so now it's 4. The counter is still 2, high is still 4, so this still evaluates to true. Let's keep running. And we're beginning to see the problem. Maybe you have noticed counter is not changing. And the Boolean expression I'm using to control this loop is that we're going to go until the counter is greater than this parameter, this whatever this value is that got passed in. This is an infinite loop, right? If I don't, I've made the most common mistake that I think your inexperienced programmers, I should say, make with a loop, which is I forgot to increment my counter, and so this is an infinite loop. And in fact, if I just say, okay, let's run this out from here, step this out from here, it's now stuck. Okay. So this seems to be where our error was happening. All right. Now, in the process of stepping through that, it was easier for me to tell than just by looking at the code. I could see that counter wasn't updating. So I need to add code in here that updates the counter. And so depending on how we're wanting this method to work, I can just put a plus plus right there. That's the increment operator, right? And so that's going to add one onto counter. Now, I want to run it again, but I know now where the problem has been. And so I'm not sure I really need to step through all that stuff before that. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to turn off my breakpoint. And I'm going to put a breakpoint. It doesn't have to be just in our main method. I can put a breakpoint down here. I'm going to put a breakpoint right there before we set the counter, initialize that counter and begin the loop so that I can hurry through the first part of the program and then just stop when we get to the part that has the problem. So let's go ahead and run that again. So far, so good. We've gotten through without crashing, so I didn't break anything in the process. And now let's start stepping through this loop. So sum is 0, counter's 2. I can already see that this is better because after I executed that line of code, sum went from 0 to 2 and counter went from 2 to 3. And that before was the problem, right? It was staying at 2. And so now I'm going to keep executing it. Now it's 4. Now it's 5. Now my Boolean expression here is that less than or equal um, to the high value, which is 4. So we got one more execution to go. And now we're done. We're out. And the sum at this point is 9. And so sum was, we would use the term, this is an accumulator. An accumulator, just as a reminder, is a variable we set up before we run a loop. And then within the loop, we kind of update that value to sort of accumulate of data or a value. And then after the loop is done, we have kind of finished that calculation. So now it's going to return that sum back to where we came from. So now if I step over that, rand sum, or sorry, between sum is 9. That was that result that we returned. And we can now sort of hit continue and see if our program works the rest of the way. And it looks like it didn't. We seem to have another error. So let's kind of reset the table here. I'm going to stop that and kind of clean up myself here. Get rid of that breakpoint because now I think we're okay there. And let's just kind of catch our breath and figure out what we want to do from here. All right, so I know my code is good as far as up until at least the point where we call sum between function. These next two are print line methods, print line calls, so I have to assume those are okay. Again, the Java team, I'm assuming, did a good job with that method, and I'm not going to have any problems there. So all that's left in this program is this function called print between, and print between, I'm going to pass it 5 and 10. So I could put my breakpoint right there, right? I could also just find this print between method, and I could put my breakpoint right there at the start of it. So let's go ahead and start debugging this. And I've cleared those breakpoints. Oh, maybe I'll take a moment to point out, if I did still have my breakpoints, where was it? I think it was maybe right here. Multiple breakpoints here. I should take a moment to show this. I've got multiple breakpoints. I've got the previous one, and now I've added this one in this print between method. So if I run my code in debug mode here, it's going to stop. It's going to hit that first breakpoint and stop. I can do whatever I need to do, step through things, step into, step out of, whatever. And once I'm satisfied that's okay, I can hit the continue button, and program execution is going to resume up until it hits another breakpoint. And so now I've hit this second breakpoint and I've stopped again. So this is useful because maybe there are a few different places along the way that you want to just stop and take a look at some variable values or see what's going on with your program. So set multiple breakpoints. It's very easy if you stop at one and oh, I don't really need to look at this again. You just hit continue and you're on your way. You can also, of course, toggle off that breakpoint and not have to worry about it anymore. Okay, back on topic here. We are in this print between method. This is meant to be a method that's just going to print out the values between these two numbers. And it looks good maybe at a glance. There is a pretty obvious problem here. So let's just step through and see what happens. So I've gotten inside, I've initialized my value to 5. That's where we're going to start. And if you hover over it, it'll show you the value. That's 10. It's also shown here. It's also shown there. So we're going to print, I assume that this is supposed to print 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So let's go ahead and step through. The loop is working, but nothing's printing. And this is, of course, kind of sort of silly. The print line statement is empty. You might notice that the terminal down here is kind of adding a blank line every time because this empty print line statement. So we just forgot to print our counter. So I'll give it a little bit of, I'll just say counter equals plus count. And let's run this again. At this point, I'm just going to start debugging mode. I got rid of that first breakpoint. I was about to go clear it, but I had already cleared it. So here we are in the print between method. I'm going to step it forward now. Okay, counter equals 5. I'm going to keep just stepping through that. Counter equals 5. Uh-oh. Counter equals 5. I've committed the same sin as before. I have not modified my control variable for this loop. And so I am once again stuck in an infinite loop. And in fact, if I hit the continue button, you really get the full effect of the infinite loop. You lose it after it scrolls off the screen, but it's still going. Okay, so I've got to increment that number, right? And so I'm going to do kind of a popular thing for programmers working in loops. I'm just going to use the increment operator right here inside this print line statement. And since I put the plus plus after count, it's going to put that value into the print line statement, and then after that, it's going to add one to it. If I put plus plus on the front of it, right, then it's going to increment the number first and then put that new number into my print line statement. So I want to print the number I've got first and then add one onto it. So let's try this one more time. I'm once again going to hit that breakpoint and I'm going to start stepping through. Counter equals 5, counter equals 6. Now we're looking pretty good. 8, 9, 10, and it's out. I got happy with my clicks there and I just went right through it. I'm back in my main method now. I'm actually on the very end of my main method here, so let's see what happens. I click it again. Oops! Oh, I clicked. I clicked step over, and it is stepping over the end of the program because even though my code is finished, um, the Java environment has stuff that it needs to take care of, and so there is an exit method that runs at the end of our program. This little comment points out that the VM, this is called by the VM, the virtual machine, which is our Java runtime. And I'm going to go ahead and step out of there. I don't need to get into all that stuff in this video. And it's now finished executing and everything is good to go. I'm going to hide that thread class because that's really confusing stuff for beginners. I'm going to go ahead and clear my breakpoint here. And let's just clean up my workspace here and take a look at all of our code. That's probably a pretty good place to stop here. This video is already getting a little bit longer than I had intended for it. There are a lot of other features that VS Code offers and probably your other IDEs as well for debugging, and you're welcome to go and explore those. But hopefully this gives you just some basic abilities to set breakpoints and step through so that you can keep an eye on what your programs are doing when you are trying to debug. As always, reach out if you have any questions.